Welcome back, everybody, to me talking about Discworld. Yes, we finally got back to talking along in the great Discworld read-along that I'm hosting currently, and we're talking today about number 20, Hogfather, because there's no better time to talk about a Christmas novel than mid-June, when it's like 30 degrees outside. I think that makes a lot of sense, and that's what we're going to do today. The next one will obviously be Jingo, and we're going to talk about it on the 10th of July. So if you want to join us or jump back in, that's the time. Join us on the Unabridged Burners Discord. I'll put the link down in the description box, and yeah, let's talk about it, shall we? Why, cheers. Alright, we're going to do this the usual way, which is quick synopsis, and then we'll talk about aspects that make this book specifically good or bad, and, you know, that I think stand out in this one, in that long catalogue of Discworld novels that exists. We're sort of halfway there now. Which I guess tells us that we'll be done by next year with the whole read-along. We will see. So yeah, let's talk about Hogfather. It's a book about Susan and death and a Christmas-y holiday on Discworld. It's very much that. Something has happened to the Hogfather, and people need to find out what happened. That's sort of the really quick synopsis, because I don't want to spoil anything, and y'all should go and read it, because it is really a good one. It's not the perfect Discworld novel. It's not my favorite, but it's a very solid one for, like, the mid-Discworld period. And it has the death of the rats and the raven in it, so there you go. And a lot of wizards, and other things. So yeah. Let's talk about details, because, yeah, go and read it, and then come back and we talk about the details. Alright, so I want to talk a bit about why it's Christmassy, the problems with Christmassy stories, and the aspect of folklore, and once again the aspect of poverty, which, you know, all ties together. So let's start with a very positive thing that I personally really appreciate about Hogfather, and that is how Terry Pratchett ties Christmas or the winter solstice celebrations in all kinds of ways back into folklore. Now, I'm personally a fan of folklore, not so much because I'm an expert on folklore, I'm not, but because especially older folklorists in the 19th century made up a lot of, like, really fun elements and ideas and stories and narratives on, like, how folklore, different folklores and traditions work, that I guess aren't really true anymore, but they make for fantastic material if you're running your own D&D game or inclined to use, you know, to write fantasy stories and stuff. It's just really cool shit, because it's kind of bonkers, and we do like that stuff around here. So there we go. And Pratchett does that in a wonderful way. He ties the whole thing back to sacrificial kings, the king of the bean, the idea that a human was sacrificed, usually a king, to bring back the sun, to renew the year, and so forth. And that is something that I personally like a lot. I don't know if you have ever read James Fraser's The Golden Bough. If not, I recommend you do. It's something. And it's sort of where that theory of the sacrificial king is explored in a lot of ways by bringing up a ton of weird examples of different Indo-European traditions, and trying to create an overarching narrative that probably doesn't really hold, you know, can, you know, actually make sense nowadays, but it's fun to read, and it's one of those grand theories that I so appreciate in older academia, when people come up with something like, yeah, I've explained everything, here's my big book, which is unfortunately not now how science works, not how academia in general works, but it's fun to read. And Pratchett takes that, builds that story into his world, which is Discworld. He does exactly that. It's like, yeah, that's how that works. And he makes nods to some other of those weirder, odder, winter solstice pagan culture, you know, traditions that are still around. The idea of killing a wren and parading it through the village, which is something that for example, Elizabeth Hand also comes up with or nods towards in Wilding Hall. So it lends the book that very specific British attitude, that very specific British air that a lot of the Terry Pratchett novels have. Not all of them, but a lot of them do have that, and I personally appreciate that very much because it's something that doesn't often come up in your average traditional fantasy or classic fantasy or even contemporary fantasy. We kind of shy away from the bloodier and darker sides of of folklore and tradition, and Pratchett does not shy away from it, which is something that I personally really appreciated. That's definitely a high point for me in this book, and I do really, really like it. And what else did I want to talk about? Like, yes, it's a Christmas story. It's very explicitly a Christmas story, so it kind of falls into that thing that we've seen before, where Pratchett takes a very specific topic, be it movies, be it rock and roll music, be it musical and opera, and transports it into Discworld, and then creates a bit of a commentary around that specific cultural phenomenon. Now, to be fair, unlike moving pictures or soul music, Hogfather and Hogswatch, the weird Christmassy winter solstice celebration with pigs, has been part of Discworld lore for a long time. Hogswatch, I think, is actually mentioned in that first description of the Discworld calendar at the beginning of Color of Magic. So it's been part of Discworld all the time. So it's not like this intrusion of an element of our world into Discworld. It's part of Discworld from the start, which, is, as he says, a mirror of worlds. So there's that. So it is very much a commentary on Christmas, and that in itself is not necessarily a bad thing. It does, however, lead to the issue that I think I sometimes have with Hogfather, while I do appreciate a lot of smaller bits, jokes, one-liners, and whatnot, and that is that specific criticism of Christmas and Christmas celebrations that Pratchett brings into this book is not very unique. It's something that we have seen for ages, especially if we're looking on the more progressive or more left-leaning side of culture, which is, an argument about commercialism, about commodification, and so forth. We'll go through them in a bit, and yeah, it's not unique, which kind of takes away from Discworld, which in a lot of cases has very unique, or not unique, but for its time, nuanced and more unique tastes than a lot of other fantasy at the time. So yeah, basically, the question, my criticism here is that the idea that Christmas or a winter solstice holiday, whatever you want to celebrate there, has been taken over by capitalism, which means that the idea of sharing gifts, sharing friendship, sharing love, whatever you want to call it, and coming together has been taken over by giving each other very expensive gifts, and thus the spirit that was behind the whole story has kind of gotten lost. Now that is, as I said, something that people that don't like Christmas the way it is celebrated, or not celebrated, but like performed by a large part of the Western world every year, have voiced forever. The idea that you don't give it. I do that with my sister because we're lazy, I guess. But to not give presents, to just come together, or only give presents that you actually made yourself and not buy something. Those are trends that have been around forever, right? And the idea that, the spirit of Christmas, or in this case, the spirit of Hogswatch, has been lost because of that commercialism, has obviously been around for a while. So while the criticism is still correct, it does not hit that hard because, there are, of course, other aspects that do work well, and I'll obviously point those out in a second. A quick aside, because I just forgot it when I talked about folklore and stuff. The plot line with Tea Time, Mr. Tea Time, going to the tooth fairy and taking the teeth to control through teeth magic to control the belief of children, is another part of that old folklore, kind of gruesome magic aspects of folklore that you rarely see in fantasy. I mean, you sometimes see it, but not that much. And that Pratchett includes that is also like adding this like slightly dark edge to it that I personally do appreciate. Just wanted to say that because I forgot it earlier. All right, let's talk about the part where the Christmas criticism does actually work. And it's still not very unique in a way, but it's something that is less often voiced. And that's the idea of charity. Because by framing Christmas, or in this case Hogswatch, as a commercial holiday, Pratchett comes back to one of his favorite topics, or one of the topics that really drive him, and that is inequality and poverty and the way we deal with it. What I mean by that is that Pratchett finds a lot of ways during this novel to showcase that while there is that overt celebration or performance of Hogswatch with expensive gifts and all of that stuff, on the one hand, that only works because there's another part of society, the poor, the people that are, as he often calls them, the invisible people, that suffer because they can't afford to partake in that performance of Christmas. They're disenfranchised, and Pratchett finds several ways to show that, in all kinds of ways, and how that performance is somewhat fragile because we all are sort of aware of the issues there and are aware of the fact that Christmas, or in this case Hogswatch cheer, is a performance. And Pratchett finds ways to show that. We have the aspect of like people not getting having their childhood memories of Nobby Nobbs and Albert, about like how they never get what they wish for, how their dreams are never fulfilled. We have the very brutal scene of the little match girl that is dying when Death, as Hogfather, intervenes and saves her life, which is a fantastic and powerful scene. Incidentally, it reminds me a lot of the scene with Hood in Toll the Hounds. Spoiler for Toll the Hounds, when Hood saves that one guard after he has a heart attack. I like that idea because it is exactly that point where both Hood and Death, or both authors Terry Pratchett and Stephen Erickson, show that their creature, their personification of death, does rebel against the fact that they are impartial by force and can't actually, judge. They're not non-judgmental by force because of their role. And they rebel against it. And Death does this here with the little match girl. But the idea that a lot of the performance of Christmas, or in this case Hogswatch, is so successful because people that are able to perform Hogswatch are aware of the fact that they are well off. So there is something for them to be thankful for. And they can only be thankful for the fact that they are well off because they know in their heart of hearts somewhere that there are people less well off than them. So that aspect is something that Pratchett works out fairly well. And adds that other aspect that I really appreciate with him when he talks about disenfranchisement and poverty, with the idea that charity is another performance in that way. We have that group of the Wassailers. They are singing and gathering charity for people that are less well off, but not too poor, not too disenfranchised, because actual poverty and actual disenfranchisement are hard to accept or hard to witness. So they gather and they're charitable towards very picturesque or fairly clean disenfranchised or poor people, and run away when they meet the invisible people that being foul or Ron, the Duckmen, or that group of beggars, because they're not willing to actually face up to actual poverty, because even charity becomes a form of performance that is, performed to help one's own ego. And once again, those are not necessarily new or revolutionary ideas. We're all aware of those criticisms of charity during, holiday season, when everyone goes and donates when they can to sort of soothe their own conscience. We've heard that criticism before, but Pratchett, taking a comedic novel, and including those dark, glimpses into the more brutal and more dark side of that whole performance of a holiday, is certainly something that I do appreciate, and it works. It works better than the just like aspects with the Hogfather grotto when they are, giving away presents and stuff. That just felt a bit shallow because we've seen that before a lot. So having that darker side to it is something that I do appreciate, and that I think makes the book a good book and still relevant because, even a lot of our Christmas performances that include criticism of the commercial elements and so forth do shy away from those darker glimpses of it. And Pratchett tearing away that almost tissue paper, that almost tissue over those open wounds of society is always welcome. He does that in a fairly good way. All right. What else is there to talk about? There is one other thing, that is the philosophy of Terry Pratchett. One of the parts of Terry Pratchett's philosophy that kind of spins the metaphysics behind this book. And that is the idea of belief and of stories, of narratives. And that final idea that if the Hogfather is killed, the sun won't rise, but a mere ball of burning gas will illuminate the planet. And that there is a fundamental difference between those two. And that's what Susan calls trickery with words, is actually constitutive for us as humans, that we build narratives, that we tell ourselves stories to explain who we are and why the world is the way that it is, and that is constitutive for and part of the condition, the conditio humana, the human condition. That is an essential part of that, and that we are, and this is, I guess, where the criticism of commercialism and so forth kind of falls into, which is that everyone is no longer believing in the Hogfather and thinks it's their parents and so forth, that we are moving away or losing our humanity by turning those narratives into a performance of capitalism, into a mere performance, and losing that meaning behind it, taking those things seriously, which I guess is an important aspect of performance, basically. The difference between performance and ritual, that in one you actually believe in what you do, in the other you perform for an audience and you don't necessarily need to believe yourself. And I think that's a pretty deep aspect to the story that I personally do appreciate, and it's something that I can think about and in my own look at how I see human nature and how I see humanity. So that's a fine part of it, and I do appreciate that aspect. There's obviously more to look at, which is Terry Pratchett's rather snide comments on childcare, child rearing, and education, which are fun to watch when you have Susan as her as governess, and how she is telling children what is really there and not making up stories around it and stuff like that. Those are the parts where you can see how Terry Pratchett is really good at watching and observing human nature. One of the things that he's just in general really good, which has fun elements when you have the idea where the children are all watching the real boar pissing in the warehouse in the shop, and that's really funny because if I was a kid I would be fascinated by a pig pissing, and Pratchett making that into something of a running joke is, I think, fundamentally where Pratchett is so good, which is, really good at observing how human nature works. And, he does that a bunch of times when he looks at the dynamics between the wizards, although those are obviously way over the top, but he does that in a good way. And, all of that adds to the overall thing. Another thing that I find fascinating about this book is that it does, in a way, copy the idea of a Christmas special that you used to have with all kinds of media, whether it's Doctor Who or Star Wars and others, which we see here because he kind of gives just about everyone at least a short cameo to show up and show their idea of Christmas, including the orangutan, the librarian, the wizards, Well, the only ones we're missing are actually the witches, but everyone else just has a quick, like, showing up somewhere, doing a Christmassy thing, and yeah, I mean, it's fun. Getting that backstory on Nobby Nobbs was definitely really cool. Um, Seeing the one religious fanatic be the one to criticize crass commercialism of Hogswatch is also really a nice dig, because we obviously always have that from the more fundamental Christian people criticizing Christmas commercialism on the one hand, and then obviously the the non-religious left. But yeah, those aspects are good and they are well done. I just feel that with that specific topic of Christmas and us having so much to do with that shit anyway, it kind of lacks a bit of punch, is I guess what I mean. And by punch, I mean the physical one, not the drink. Because that one kind of shows up because it's Christmas, right? And beyond that, yes, the humanity. Let's talk about the plot real quick, with the idea of an assassin going to the realm of the Tooth Fairy, stealing the teeth, and that assassin being an absolute psychopath. And Pratchett shows once again, which he doesn't show too often, that he can be really dark when it comes to describing his villains. Vorbis in Small Gods is a very scary villain. Mr. Tea Time, or Te Atime, is another one. How he just like murders people because he has no use for them. How he just he's completely psychotic. Yeah, that's scary. That's not what you'd expect in like a comedy novel, right? And it's the skill of Terry Pratchett to actually be able to do that, while at the same time, for example, very much humanizing Banjo and medium Dave Lillywhite and the other like normal criminals and thugs, and like how they are basically human beings with like skewed morals, but they do have morals and they know what's right and what's wrong. And having that element in there is another thing that I do think makes this book so good, because yeah, Pratchett is able to show the humanity in a lot of characters, and not many authors are able to do it that consistently. Are there final thoughts on it? I guess it's a fun book, just not as fun as some of the others, and it has a lot of great one-liners, and the dialogue, the dynamics between the Raven and the Death of the Rats are, of course, fantastic, as are the attempts of Death and Susan to build up familiar relationships in some way, and their basic incapability to actually communicate with each other. That's kind of sad and dark, but it's realistic when you talk about, family dynamics. So once again, Pratchett, great observer of human nature. His criticism of holiday celebrations or holiday performance, while poignant and, correct, does unfortunately not hit as hard as it could, because it's something that we've seen from other sides. His inclusion or connection of those holidays to rituals and the way humanity tells itself stories that make us human, that's a really cool thing. And the inclusion of like Fraser-esque folklore is just a bonus for nerds like me. I guess that's more or less it. I hope you enjoyed the book. I know it's a favorite of a lot of people. Let me know what you think about it in the comments. Like, subscribe, share. Right now I'm missing one subscriber to reach my goal of 800 for my birthday tomorrow, so maybe help me out there. Wouldn't that be cool? Anyway, I'll see you tomorrow. Have a great day. Cheers.